Greetings, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about Weimar Germany for A-level history. So I was talking about political violence in 1919, around the time that the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Let's see, in Bavaria, that's a southern state of Germany, the person who'd ruled Bavaria as a Soviet Republic, Die Räterepublik, was going to resign. He felt it was not viable, and he was shot dead at the time. The man who killed him was given life imprisonment, not the death penalty, though the death penalty was allowed. The man was later released to a hero's welcome when the Nazis came to office. That's another point I should have made. Germany was divided into many states. So there was the federal government in Berlin, and then state governments had a degree of autonomy within that. There was quite strong regional identities, whether it was Bavarian or Prussian or a Rhinelander and so on, something which hasn't entirely disappeared. Bear in mind, Germany only became a single country in 1871, so Germany being 36 separate countries was well within living memory at the time. Indeed, France had wanted to revert to that situation, saying, well, France has been a country since ancient Roman times, really, that Germany should be split up into 36 separate countries who might be warring against each other. Bavaria could become a French ally, as it had been in former times. Anyway, that didn't happen. The French had agitated for a buffer state, in Western Germany along the French frontier, so that France would never be threatened by Germany again. Bear in mind, France had been invaded in 1870. And again in 1914, admittedly in 1870, the French declared war first. So they never ever wanted to go through this most unimaginable suffering again. Right, so back to the situation in Germany. Well, the Treaty of Versailles, it allowed the French to occupy the Rhineland. River Rhine flows through Western Germany, forms a border with France for a bit. And indeed, the Allies had been allowed in there as part of the armistice in 1918. French and British troops were there right after the end of the war, controlling the bridges along the Rhine, just in case Germany didn't sign in June 1919. The French and British would be in much better position to invade the rest of Germany. So some of the British soldiers professed themselves to be deeply upset seeing starving children walking around, and that was a result of the blockade. This is an aspect of the war that the Western Allies don't like to face up to. The blockade was a major factor in bringing Germany to its knees. Now, it's a blunt instrument because it starved civilians more than soldiers, and I suppose that was the harsh reality of war, especially at the time, is even now to some extent. So the Treaty of Versailles said the French were allowed to occupy the Rhineland for 15 years afterwards. And if after 5 years the Germans were cooperating, in the opinion of Paris, the French would withdraw to a certain line. If after 10 years the Germans were still abiding by the terms of the treaty, in the opinion of the French government, that is, the French would withdraw to a further line, and 15 years after Versailles, if the Germans were still behaving themselves, in Paris's opinion, then the French army would withdraw completely. As I pointed out, that France had lots of African colonies, and so some French soldiers were black. They were in all-black units. And some of the black French soldiers had romantic relationships with German women, as a result of which children were born. I'll tell you what happened to them later when the Nazis came to office. So Germany was an international pariah. The League of Nations was founded by the Treaty of Versailles. That was the equivalent of the United Nations. It had its headquarters at Geneva in Switzerland. Germany was not permitted to join that. The only other country which was banned from joining at the time was Russia, which is a communist country. Russia was soon to rename itself the Soviet Union, uniting with several of her neighbours. So skipping forward a little bit, Germany and the Soviet Union recognised that as they were both outcasts, they could help each other. And so in 1922, at Rapallo in Italy, they signed a pact. The Soviet Union and Germany dropped all claims against each other for reparations or territory arising from the First World War, and agreed to cooperate economically. And as I pointed out, Germany wasn't allowed to possess certain military equipment, and so German soldiers went to the Soviet Union to train in some of the prohibited equipment. That was signed by Walter Rathenau, the German Foreign Secretary. He was later shot dead for having signed that, for cooperating with communists. In fact, he was furthering Germany's national interests, working with the Soviet Union, something that the National Socialists would do later. Far from being anti-patriotic, Rathenau was the man who'd run Germany's war economy and had really worked miracles by keeping it going with almost no imports for 4 years. The man who shot him dead was Count Arco Valle. Again, he's a man who was to be released by the Nazis. He got life imprisonment, not capital punishment. The judiciary were mostly conservative-minded, pined for the Kaiser, and they tended to look kindly on right-wing terrorists. Anyway, so Germany was beset by economic woes. 2 million men had been killed, men of the most economically productive age usually. A lot of men were permanently disabled from the war. They had legs blown off, they were blinded, they had their right arm blown off, not to mind the psychological scars. And so there were lots of widows and orphans and so forth. And, Germany just hadn't invested or repaired for years. And it wasn't difficult to regain export markets, things like that. So there was a very grave poverty in the early 1920s. And Germany was just stabilising the situation when in 1921, the Allied Reparations Commission announced the amount Germany was going to have to pay. They said at £6.6 billion. Now, £6.6 billion is chump change for any government now. There wasn't much inflation until those days, but back then it was a staggering sum. Now, admittedly, it wasn't the whole cost of the war, because everybody knew there's absolutely no way Germany could pay that off. So Germany was beset by her own economic woes, but now was going to have to compensate the Allies. Germany had to hand over most of her merchant fleet to the Allies. That's ships which transport goods for trade. So Germany did begin by paying this off. Crucially, as I say, it was set in pounds sterling, not German marks, because if so, Germany could simply print marks to the value of the reparations, and the mark would pretty soon lose value. As we'll see, the mark did fall in value precipitously. So the French thought the terms were very soft, but by God, they were going to get every last centime that they were owed. And so when in 1923, Germany defaulted and said, we simply can't pay, the French said, forget it, Crimea River. French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr, which is a very industrialised conurbation in the very west of Germany, and occupied it. Borders Belgium said, if you're not going to hand over the money, we will take goods to the value of what is owed us. That's a coal-rich region. Bear in mind, a century ago, coal was as important as oil is now. We didn't use oil so much back then. Coal for steamships, those some switched to oil. Coal for trains, certainly domestic heating. Factories were powered by burning coal. So the French were going to take coal and other valuables. And the German workers, they went on strike, as ordered by the German government, refused to cooperate. The French, along with their own unemployed, they were suffering severe economic difficulties after the war. They brought in some of their own unemployed workers, gave them jobs. The Belgians likewise, because the Germans were refusing to cough up. So the French were removing coal, timber and so on. Some Germans sabotaged trains. France proclaimed martial law in the Ruhr, so there'd be the death penalty for saboteurs. One German, Leo Schlachter, was caught sabotaging trains, was executed by the French army for doing so. Indeed, Hitler mentioned this man on the first page of his book, Mein Kampf. So the German government paid these Ruhr workers not to work and printed more money to do so, which led to hyperinflation, which is when the value of money goes down and down, and it became utterly crazy. You want to pay for your meal at the beginning because the price will have gone up by the end, and people's pensions became worthless. Anyone on a fixed income was screwed. Those who could hire themselves out and set their rates or sell things, they were all right. Some people did well out of this. Debts were wiped out because the price of a house last year becomes the price of a tricycle this year. And there was no point in saving anything. Anyone who could earn in a foreign currency and spend in Germany was doing well. If you could persuade someone to lend you money in the beginning, then you'd have to pay them back virtually nothing at the end. So it got to the stage where people were burning banknotes because that made more sense than trying to spend them, making kites out of banknotes, wallpapering their house in banknotes, or the expression, it's not worth the paper it's printed on, became true. That let's see, a piece of paper cost 100 marks. and this the money has less value than that. It's a hard concept. How much is a piece of paper worth? A penny, but it could say £50 on it. All right, but the actual value, the £50, wouldn't buy you that piece of paper because money's lost so much value. It's a difficult concept. Grapple with it. Anyhow, in the 1920s in time, Germany was to become more stable. I'll go into the particulars later.